Next up, we have Andrew Lee. Andrew is a PhD student at the Cinema Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. His research centers on depictions of climate catastrophe and apocalypse in mainstream media, with a focus on the ways in which real-world anxieties surrounding climate change can be seen reflected in popular movies and video games. He's also interested in the role that institutions such as government, the church, and partisan think tanks have played in shaping popular perceptions of climate change and the way those perceptions are reflected and reinforced in culture more broadly. Andrew's paper is entitled Apocalypse Again and Again, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Global Warming. Let's welcome Andrew.
Thank you for the warm welcome and for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. So can you all see that? Okay. The title of my presentation for you all is Apocalypse Again and Again, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Global Warming. And this is taken from a much larger project. It's from my attempt at condensing my master's thesis into like an article length thing. So hopefully that makes it all make sense, and we'll see how it goes. So I'm just going to get started. As media scholar Lynn Spiegel has observed, in the wake of the 9/11 terror attacks, American popular culture experienced a widespread shift as, quote, traditional forms of entertainment had to reinvent their place in US life and culture. The sense of shock and destabilization that could be felt in the aftermath of 9/11 imbued images of fictional destruction with a new sense of responsibility, particularly with regards to the destruction of cityscapes. While disaster movies of the previous era often openly delighted in the pure spectacle of destruction, what popular video essayist Lindsay Ellis has referred to as depictions of a, quote, fun apocalypse, this new era of post-9/11 disaster films were more focused on sentimental stories of family and togetherness around which the destruction occurred. I want to suggest that this effort to speak to a destabilized American public in the wake of 9/11 led to a series of Hollywood disaster films that focused on reasserting traditional family values rooted in conservative Christian morality, such as the importance of the traditional family structure and strong male leadership in the face of adversity. In these films, the apocalypse functions as the culminating point of human history, a force with the power to enact positive socio-historical change. And the narrative is anchored to a fractured nuclear family who begin the film apart and then reunify through the power of this apocalyptic force. I see this dynamic at play in at least 5 feature films. The Day After Tomorrow, directed by Roland Emmerich, 2004. War of the Worlds, directed by Steven Spielberg, 2005. 2012, directed by Roland Emmerich again, 2009. San Andreas, directed by Brad Peyton, 2015, and Geostorm, directed by Dean Devlin, 2017. By focusing on disasters of apocalyptic scale and their power to reassert traditional Christian values, these films figure the apocalypse not only as the culminating point of human history, but specifically as a cleansing force, reinforcing a Christian fundamentalist view that society is in decay, largely due to the disintegrating status of the traditional family, and that the apocalypse, which is conceived of as inevitable, unstoppable, and preordained, has the power to revert these social structures back to their proper state. Now, I must be clear here. I'm not asserting that these disaster films exist only as a reflection of broader cultural currents. As film scholar Stephen Keen has written, quote, the more practical industrial fact is that it only takes one commercially successful film to spark an interest in bringing certain long forgotten or financially obsolete genres back round again, unquote. Certainly, the international box office success of The Day After Tomorrow was sufficient to launch a series of copycats. Likewise, images of disaster have played a formative role in cinema since its beginning, particularly in the United States. As media scholars Andrea Stolman-Dennett and Nina Warnk have demonstrated, spectacles of disaster such as immense fires and military conflicts were the subject of much popular entertainment at the turn of the 20th century, and because of this, many early filmmakers sought to depict these events in their films. Such films acted as entertainment and catharsis, providing, quote, pleasure seekers with the probability of confronting their fears and fantasies in theatricalized worlds of destruction, unquote. Working from a similar understanding of the function, or at least the byproduct of popular culture, I am employing a cultural reading that holds that the modern films that I have identified are indicative of palpable sentiments in the immediate 9/11 cultural atmosphere, and that these films are not only shaped by these cultural sentiments, but also contribute to and reinforce them. Despite the disaster genre's historic staying power, I also want to argue that there is something different about the cycle that I have identified, about what they have to say about their cultural moment, and I am positioning 9/11 as a moment of identifiable cultural rupture while doing so. Film scholar Wheeler Winston Dixon has described how much of American cinema after 9/11 attempted to reinvigorate senses of American identity and patriotism, in particular focusing on the ways in which many films in the immediate aftermath of the attacks, quote, centered on a desire to replicate the idea of the just war, in which military reprisals and the concomitant escalation of warfare seem simultaneously inevitable and justified, unquote. Such an account points to how real political currents, here a government-sponsored galvanization of support for war in the Middle East, can be detected within popular culture more broadly. Additionally, some cross-disciplinary scholarship and criticism has described how the consumption of images themselves, particularly of destruction, has changed or appeared to change as a result of 9/11. Many firsthand accounts describe the attacks and the images of the towers falling as appearing, quote, like a movie. In the words of Susan Sontag, after 9/11, quote, it felt like a movie seems to have displaced the way survivors of catastrophe used to express the short-term unassimilability of what they had gone through. It felt like a dream. The fact that 9/11 was witnessed and remembered by so many through video footage has created a peculiar situation in which images of fictional destruction now evoke the real catastrophe and vice versa. After 9/11, films that employed the destruction of skyscrapers became imbued with new meaning. And indeed, each film that I have identified previously either explicitly makes reference to 9/11 through dialogue or allusion, or features imagery that is unmistakably evocative of these attacks. I'm interested in how, existing as they do self-consciously in this cultural moment, The Day After Tomorrow, War of the Worlds, 2012, San Andreas, and Geostorm imagine unstoppable preordained apocalypses that media scholar Despina Kakudaki has characterized as non-sentient. This is the primary distinguishing factor between these films and, for instance, disaster films from the era of nuclear anxiety that Susan Sontag famously wrote about in The Imagination of Disaster. In that previous era, per Kakudaki, the threat of, quote, the threat of destruction translates into narratives of political choice, unquote. The threat can be reasoned with. Whereas here, the threat of apocalypse does not represent an agent which can be persuaded or reasoned with or even stopped. As a result, these narratives become about little more than survival in the face of inevitable destruction. Despite this, the films are not nihilistic. Instead, these films rely on a Christian understanding of the end of the world as purposeful and cumulative in order to figure their respective apocalyptic events as forces of social good. These films position the apocalypse as an inevitable stepping stone of existence, something that must be endured and which will give way to a better future. This figuring of the end as positive is reinforced at a formal level in each film through Hollywood conventions of the happy ending. Warm colors, triumphant music, reunited families, the promise of a better tomorrow. And pictured here are screens from the ending of each film at the moment of familial reunification. These films were released in the aftermath of the rise to prominence of what has been dubbed the Christian right, a political coalition that allied themselves with secular conservatives within the Bush White House and who sought specifically to reclaim America as a Christian nation. This post-9/11 shift toward the traditional in American politics and culture also ran parallel to an increased sense of anxiety surrounding the specter of anthropogenic climate change, an issue which was rising to political prominence at the time, having been granted an international spotlight with the Kyoto Accord, which came into effect in 2005. Beginning with The Day After Tomorrow in 2004, the environment itself quickly became a narrative device of global destruction in Hollywood disaster films. By adopting a Christian framework of apocalypse and then conflating their fictional disasters with real-world climate change, I want to suggest that these films allay fears of real-world climate change by framing it not as man-made and avoidable, but as inevitable and purposeful, as something which fits into a Christian narrative of divine culmination and resolution, a force which serves an ultimately good purpose. This message is communicated primarily through the positively coded story of familial reunification in the face of incomprehensible disaster. In the United States, the explicitly political battle surrounding the traditional family has been mainly the purview of Christian conservatives. From at least the 1970s until the mid-2000s, this battle was fought most vocally by the Christian right, a cross-denominational, primarily Protestant coalition whose political goal was to return the United States to its roots as a Christian nation. Members of this political coalition and their more recent inheritors largely believe that the nuclear family, a father, a mother, and their children, what the Christian right has referred to as the natural family, is a necessary pillar of society, and that recent gains in social progressivism, such as women's liberation, racial emancipation, and the gay rights movement, have undermined this structure and thus led to societal decay. Where exactly does this focus on the importance of the traditional family come from? Well, this question is not as easily answered as you might think. Many passages of the Christian Bible provide the blueprints for such a familial ordering, but they do not explicitly make reference to a, quote, natural family. The most direct of these passages probably comes from Genesis, in which God says to Eve, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Artist and art critic John Berger has argued that what is striking about this passage is the fact that, quote, the woman is blamed and is punished by being made subservient to the man. In relation to the woman, the man becomes an agent of God, unquote. Indeed, such an authoritative creed does give biblical legitimacy to certain aspects of family value politics, of the family value politics of these conservative Christians, such as the importance of female subservience to a male patriarch, but it does not actually outline a strict familial structure, nor does it declare that such a structure is of absolute value. As legal scholars Doris Buss and D.D. Herman have pointed out, a lack of specificity regarding familial ordering is the case for all biblical passages that the Christian right have commonly used as evidence for their interpretation of the natural family, including Proverbs 22-23, Ephesians 6, and passages from Deuteronomy. To Buss and Herman, while these various passages do proclaim the importance of child rearing and obeying parental authority, quote, the idea of a natural family as the basic cornerstone of society is not something easily identified in biblical texts, unquote. A conservative Christian focus on the importance of the traditional family arose in the late 1970s in reaction to changing societal norms, desegregation, and various civil rights victories. As political scientist Daniel Williams has argued, it became an American conservative issue more broadly, with the gradual melding of the Republican Party and the Christian right in the mid-20th century. As a result, it's important to recognize the family values politics of the films that I analyze as not simply being conservative or simply being Christian, but as having a distinctly American conservative Christian moral undercurrent. Each of these films begins with a family in disarray. The protagonist's the protagonist's ex-wife has moved on and is either dating or I dropped the sentence and converting this to a PDF, but I remember what I said. Basically, all of the films begin with a family that's been separated because the father is an absent-minded father, and the protagonist's wife has either moved on and is dating or married to a new man, often one who is wealthier, who has assumed the role of father in his children's lives. In each case, the biological father is aware of this issue and attempts to win his family's affection back, but to no avail, for he's lost the ability to connect with his children. The father is only able to win over his family's love through his ingenuity in the face of apocalyptic catastrophe, and this is key. He proves his worth. It is because of the apocalypse and not in spite of it that familial reunification can occur. 2012 provides the perfect emblematic example of this model, so I will focus my analysis with that film, but suffice it to say in the final paper, I hope to talk about all of them. The film 2012 was inspired by a series of eschatological predictions that the world would end on December 21st, 2012. The most common of these predictions was based on the Mesoamerican long count calendar used by many Mesoamerican cultures, including the Maya, which ended on this date, a fact which was interpreted by some as the Mayans having predicted the end of the world. The film utilized the buzz surrounding this prediction as built-in marketing and presented a scenario in which unexplainable solar phenomena caused the Earth's core to heat up, leading to increasingly erratic natural disasters that eventually cause a global flood, killing most life on Earth. In the film, some of humanity is able to survive aboard a series of large ships or arcs, which are constructed in secret by the G8 nations and China in a facility beneath the Himalayan mountains in Tibet. While this was ostensibly an ensemble story about global catastrophe in which people the world over would need to band together to survive, 2012 is primarily concerned with one particular white American family. Father Jackson, played by John Cusack, mother Kate, played by Amanda Peet, daughter Lily, played by Morgan Lilly, and son Noah, played by Liam James. A family who begin the narrative fractured in Los Angeles and then reunify in spite, or in fact because of, the power of the apocalypse over the course of their perilous journey to Tibet in an effort to sneak aboard one of the arcs. While there are many characters, most of the emotional force of the narrative is reserved for this reunification, which coincides with the climax of the apocalyptic disaster. The final image of the film displays the family reunified as the sun rises and harmonious music plays, signaling that an equilibrium has been reached and that humanity can go on to tackle a new day. Thus, despite the incomprehensible chaos and billions of deaths that have preceded this moment, the apocalypse is ultimately figured as a positive force that enacts social change for the better. While a pragmatic explanation for why Jackson and his family are chosen to be the protagonists of 2012 may simply be that their story would appeal most easily and broadly to the average American audience member, it then becomes paramount to examine who exactly the film envisions as its surrogate for the average American. Jackson and his family are white, middle-class Americans who live in the suburbs, but even more crucially, they are a fractured family. Early in the film, it is established that Kate has left Jackson because he's an absent-minded father. Kate is now dating the vain plastic surgeon Gordon, played by Tom McCarthy, who seems to have a better relationship with Jackson's children than he does, especially with his son Noah. These are issues put front and center narratively. It is these personal issues that are really what the film is about. In fact, from the onset, Kate, and I'm going to go back to the slide actually. In fact, from the onset, Kate's boyfriend, Gordon, appears to function entirely as a temporary figure who must be usurped, something which is reinforced within the narrative multiple times, particularly in the scene when he and Kate are grocery shopping. Gordon antagonizes Kate over her previous decision to stay married to Jackson for as long as she did, and insults his work as a writer, calling his book junk. Gordon also reveals that Kate gave up her acceptance to medical school so that she could be a mother. Kate becomes defensive of both her decision to follow a more traditional gendered path and her choice of Jackson as a romantic partner. It seems clear that Kate still has romantic feelings for her ex-husband and that it would be possible for him to win her back if only he focused more on their family. Through this family's status as surrogate for the disrupted natural family, 2012 insinuates that the forces responsible for the disintegration of family values can be overcome. Kate's lingering feelings for Jackson seem to be something that Gordon is acutely aware of and wants to eliminate. At the exact moment that Gordon tells Kate, "I just feel like there's something pulling us apart," the apocalyptic catastrophe begins and a large rift opens in the ground, literally between them, separating them. The apocalypse here acts literally as an inciting instant, the moment of change in an otherwise static equilibrium that kickstarts the reunification of the family. While Gordon's characterization does become slightly more nuanced as the plot progresses, he serves mostly as a means to an end. He does help the family in their quest for survival because he can fly an airplane, which helps them escape Los Angeles. But once Jackson returns to rescue Kate and Gordon from their home, Gordon essentially becomes an obstacle in the way of Jackson's quest to win back Kate's love. Nowhere is this reinforced stronger than towards the end of the film when Gordon is killed. While the family is attempting to sneak aboard one of the large arcs that have been built, Gordon falls and is crushed between two of the large industrial gears that open the main door, despite Jackson's attempts to save him. A grisly death that is all but instantly forgotten by the other characters. When Kate learns of his death, she is momentarily shocked and insists they must go back for him, but quickly shifts her attention to the safety of her children. Later, when she believes that Jackson, in contrast, has drowned in his effort to unjam one of the ark's malfunctioning doors, her reaction is deeply emotional. Kate is inconsolable at the thought of losing her true husband, until it is revealed that Jackson has both survived and succeeded in fixing the door, at which point this emotional reaction is emphasized formally through triumphant music as the two embrace. In the following celebration, the family reunites without a single mention of Gordon or his death, for he has both physically and thematically been replaced by Jackson. Even though billions of people on Earth have been killed, this moment is portrayed as triumphant, revealing that beyond the reunification of this particular family and the survival of the few aboard the arcs, nothing else really matters. The apocalypse has come and gone and fulfilled its purpose. The world is now again at equilibrium. Everyone aboard the ark appears joyous, even though one would expect many or most of them to be traumatized. The film ends shortly thereafter with some final narrative loose ends being resolved. Jackson embraces his family aboard the deck of the ark and tells them that wherever they are together is home. Jackson, Kate, and the two children are framed gazing off into the distance, tinted in warm orange colors, as the non-diegetic score once again triumphantly crescendos, reincorporating previous motifs into their most emotionally powerful form. The image cuts to an aerial view of the arcs traveling in formation and pulls back until it has traveled all the way into outer space, revealing that they are headed towards Africa, some of the only remaining land above water and birthplace of the human species. The natural apocalypse of 2012 is figured as unstoppable but ultimately purposeful. Like in the other films that I have identified, the primary narrative culminates in the reunification of a family as they await humanity's next steps. The apocalypse is not once figured as something that can be avoided, but is instead portrayed as an inevitability, which nevertheless serves a fundamentally good purpose, a global resetting which gives humanity a chance to revert back to its proper equilibrium. Coupled with the fact that the apocalypse of the film bears a striking resemblance to forecasts of real-world climate catastrophe, flooding, increased erratic natural disasters, etc., 2012's saccharine ending in the face of global genocide seems to suggest that if such an event were to occur, it should not be feared but welcomed as a force capable of wiping our slate clean. Thank you.